Today on An Imperfect Leader, our guests are Lori Weigel from New Bridge Strategy, a research firm based in Colorado, and Jonathan Voss from Lake Research Partners in Washington, D.C., and Berkeley, California. So, Lori and Jonathan, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
It's so nice to see you both again. For our listeners, I had the real honor of hearing Lori and Jonathan co-present to the Kansas-Missouri Superintendent Leadership Forum, and I couldn't stop taking photos of all their slides. And I know they were like, we'll make these available to you, but I could not stop myself. And we're going to get to some of those slides in a moment. But first, I think it would be really helpful for our nation's superintendents to know what makes your collaboration and partnership really, I think, a model for others. So Lori, you've directed research efforts for hundreds of political and public affairs campaigns throughout the country. And these are with roots in Republican politics, and you help your clients bridge those partisan divides. And Jonathan, your firm is firmly anchored in progressive politics, and you help your clients develop strategy and communication plans to move audiences, particularly in support of key issues like ensuring every child has quality public education, no matter their zip code. And so my question is this, and especially with the divides that we see today, what advice do you have for leaders working to really navigate these complex times? So Lori, let's start with you.
Sure. I think that one thing that we can all do is start from a position where I call it a head nod statement, where everyone in the room sort of nods their heads, no matter their partisan affiliation, no matter their zip code, no matter, where they're coming from. There's usually some values statements that everyone can agree to. When it comes to K through 12 education, we know that everyone wants to give opportunities for every child to succeed in the future. So that's something where everyone in the room is going to nod their head. Now, we may disagree about how exactly to get there, and people may have slightly different interpretations of that. But we know that when we're starting from a place where people are sharing in agreement with those core values, that we're less likely to see that friction pop up and really bubble over.
Jonathan, what would you add to that advice?
I think particularly in the K through 12 education space, focusing on the future, focusing on outcomes, it's another way of talking about values and leading with values. But what every parent cares about with their child is ensuring that they have a future where they can lead an independent life, take care of themselves, do really boring things like pay their taxes, pay their bills, and survive. And I think that for leaders in this space to be really clear-eyed and focused on what they're doing to help the children in their purview reach that goal, and really focusing on outcomes and how they talk about things. I think there's a tendency sometimes to get really deep in the weeds of policy, and certainly there are occasions and contexts where that's appropriate. But for most audiences, as Lori said, leading with values and focusing on the future and really keeping the outcomes of education in mind and how you talk about things, I think is one way to really bridge a divide.
You mentioned, Lori, head nod statements. And as Jonathan was speaking, you were making some head nods. And so I noticed some head nods on focusing on the future. That's synonymous to providing opportunities.
I think what people want is to make sure that their children are better prepared to go out and live a good life and, get a job and, just really be a productive citizen. And, they are concerned. And perhaps it's because of all the technological change that we're going through right now. And I know every era has that change. My great-grandmother moved in a covered wagon and saw men on the moon during her lifetime. So there's
amazing
always times of technological change. There's just a sense that people are concerned, like, will this job be there in the future? We all told our kids to go into STEM, and now we're maybe not having as much scientific research as we might have had. So there's just this underlying concern that we've all done what we're supposed to do, but are our kids really going to have that better life in the future? And some people are coming from a cultural perspective. Some people are coming from a career perspective on, how exactly that's going to work. But we're all sharing in that view that we want our kids to have a better life.
When I first became superintendent, I sort of unveiled 7 values, and it was like Moses and Mount. It's like, here are our values. And a few years later, the district was involved in a lawsuit from someone internally, and people took sides. And I remember turning to someone and saying, but we have these values. And that trusted leader looked at me and said, no, those are your values. They're not our values. And we had to, and I mean, it was just like, it rocked my world. And so we engage in a renewed process of really harvesting the wisdom of all the voices within the system, including student voice, and then coming back and defining what those values actually meant. And so you've helped me sort of remember that event, because both of you talked about being really clear on what those words mean. And each of you have a similar definition for independent life. I was curious, like, oh, what do you mean by independent life? But both of you have a fairly similar version. I don't know if that story sparks any memories of your own work with communities.
Well, I think one of the nice things about my job is I get to listen to people. When my children were very young and they'd say, where are you going this week? And I'd say, well, I get to go to New Hampshire. And I get to listen to people. And that's really kind of our job. And when we are speaking in the same language and the same words as the people we're talking to, it's just going to resonate in a much better way. And I think we'll talk about words and language later, but that connection and, not walking in and spewing off a bunch of acronyms, only education people know or teachers speak, that you just develop a better sense of connection when we're all speaking in the same language.
Yeah, I found that it could be incredibly alienating for community members when you're speaking in acronyms. If you're just joining us, our guests are Lori Weigel from the New Bridge Strategy and Jonathan Voss from Lake Research Partners. Now, in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's this domain called leaders learning work, and it's really the mind of the work. And inside that domain is a term, power of language. And your presentation, I think about it a lot. I have some of those slides just sitting on my desktop from time to time, but there were so many powerful statements. And so I've chosen 4. And I wanted to ask you to give us your thoughts on just those 4. So the first statement, and Jonathan, if it's all right, we'll start with you. Americans have always rated public schools in your community more favorably than in the nation as a whole. And so the slide that I have on my screen is just looking even from 1981 all the way to present, that real divide, almost a chasm between approval rating locally and approval rating nationally. So would you tell us what you've learned about that statement in particular?
Sure. And I know Lori has some things to say on this as well.
Yeah, of course.
Generally, we find that people like things that are closer to home. You like the public school in your community. You like your elected official, but you don't necessarily like Congress. You like your local public school, but you're not quite sure if the schools nationwide are doing as great a job. And so I think that tendency, when it comes to local government, you like your local government more than your state government, more than the federal government. I think the closer you are to what you're being asked about, there tends to be a little bit more of a positive sentiment. I also think that, there's some other data that we didn't share with this. If you start to look at some of the partisanship data of this as well, there was a divergence, I think, around 2008, 2009, when Obama was elected, and then also the aftermath of the Great Recession. And I think that we've seen across a variety of institutions quite a bit of deterioration on a whole host of institutions when they're thought of at the national level as well. And I think that's another thing that's going on here.
Lori, what would you add?
Sure. We call it the I'm okay, you're not phenomenon in terms of polling. And Jonathan's absolutely right. It extends to elected leaders and government. We've even seen, for example, when we'll test crime, and we just say crime in general, how big a problem is that versus crime in your neighborhood? And people are like, oh, crime's terrible everywhere else, but their ratings for crime in their neighborhood are exceedingly low. So that concept of, oh, I've heard there's problems out there, it must apply to other people because I may be not seeing it every single day. Elections and administration of elections, same thing. Like, I'm really satisfied with how elections were run in my area. Oh, but somewhere out there in the big city,
there's a ton of corruption somewhere else.
Right. So it's a typical normal dynamic that we see in polling data. One question we often ask people when we're looking at a particular school district is, have you been in a public school in your area, in that district lately? And and it doesn't matter for what, right? It doesn't mean that they have to have kids in the school. They could have gone to theater production or, whatever it might be, or community events. But that having been in a public school usually impacts their views of public schools in their district dramatically. They are more apt to want to fund them better. They feel they rate them better. There's just a great deal of connection. So just even having walked in a building and welcoming the community to your schools can have a huge impact on how people are connected to the schools and their views of them.
That's really interesting, particularly because I'm going to point out another slide that you shared. And that is, for us, when we did a communication survey, we discovered that 90% of our community got their information from friends and neighbors. And so when I think about who's most likely in schools, parents have opportunities to be in schools, guardians, relatives, those types of things. And so when the statement is that voters trust teachers, parents, and parent organizations when it comes to issues surrounding public schools, I mean, that really resonates in terms of what you just said, that because it's more likely that they have been in the schools and can bless the good work that's happening, that they have more faith and confidence in those people than perhaps further down the line that even has superintendent and business leaders than elected officials and those types of people.
Yeah, voters tend to trust people that are on the front lines. And that's true for anything. If we're talking about healthcare, they are more likely to find nurses to be credible than the hospital administrator, right? It makes sense. So it's the same dynamic when we get to school. It's like they see the teacher in the classroom and they probably know what's going on here, how well things are being run, what's happening with our resources or lack of resources. And, so we just tend to see that frontline messenger is so critically important in terms of people's confidence and trust.
I can remember public saying, well, teachers are buying their own supplies. And I would say, but I don't fully understand that because our district is well-resourced and we're buying supplies. And what we're missing is if a teacher potentially was doing a special project that they were sort of leading, they may be buying supplies for their classroom that was different from the sort of basic supplies that I know I didn't have as a teacher in a metropolitan district on the West Coast. So when I was in Oakland, I definitely was buying pencils and stuff like that. Where I was in the Midwest, we provided that. However, that didn't translate. And so then there was this sort of narrative that teachers had to buy their own supplies. And they didn't always get corrected because it certainly served a certain purpose.
Also, and as a child of two public school teachers, actually, music teachers, my dad taught, I don't know for how many years, 20, 30 years in Scarsdale, which is a very affluent suburb of New York City. And my mom taught in public schools in Orange County. And I remember when I was going to elementary, middle, and high school, and I went to a decent high school, Munner Woodbury, Go Crusaders in Orange County. But the difference in resources between my high school, which was still a well-resourced high school, and the state of the computer lab at Scarsdale was just night and day between what was. So there's a great amount of disparity between districts still.
I want to return to this idea of how do you then make efforts. If you're a superintendent listening and you're saying, okay, well then how do I influence potentially my community's perspective or thoughts on my school, is find ways to get them into your buildings, in a way that is somewhat orchestrated, because with safety and security issues these days, you can't just say, come on in anytime you want. But, from anything from, I knew a superintendent who brought free passes to all of the senior citizen communities to say, we'd love for you to come see our plays, our musicals, and our sporting events. So, because we recognize you don't have children in the schools, you may not even have grandchildren in the schools, and yet we're going to ask you to raise taxes. And so we want to make sure that you understand what we're trying to achieve and that you care about this generation because somebody cared about yours, kind of thing. One of the things that I saw, another statement, was teaching children how to work well and get along in a racially and economically diverse environment versus teaching children how to work well and get along with people who are different than they are. And that had radically different responses based on what was considered, at least on the slide you shared, pro-public school, pro-choice, those types of different groups. I wonder if you would speak to that slide.
Certainly, I can take this, came from our data. I think this speaks to another trend that has emerged recently, especially I think when you think of all of the rhetoric in the headlines right now about DEI and attacks on DEI, and also on social emotional learning, which I don't think is as attacked as, quote, DEI, but is still something that is in the crosshairs of some activists. There are these terms that end up being partisan cues. And so what I think is happening here, given what we know about the anti-public school base, which is what we charted in there, that's the group that really didn't respond to the term racially and economically diverse, is that idea of racial diversity ends up being a little bit of a cue for them. And it ends up being language that they recoil against. We did more recent testing, for example, around social and emotional learning or diversity, equity, inclusion, where we tested those statements against the outcomes that those statements were trying to do, right? So for social and emotional learning, I forget the exact language we tested, but it was, do you favor or oppose social and emotional learning, comma, in order to help children gain the skills and confidence to work together in teams and solve problems. And in that same statement, without that, the actual phrase social and emotional learning. And what we saw was that the folks in the sample who you might anticipate hearing part of that media ecosystem that denigrates social and emotional learning, they were the only ones who really responded negatively to that term. But when we just talked about what social and emotional learning produces, confidence, skills in working together, and et cetera, again, I forget exactly how we defined it, everyone really agreed with that statement. And so these terms, and I know the whole point of this conversation, at least this part of it, was to talk about language. These terms mean different things to different people. And for example, with diversity, we did another project where diversity among more progressive voters was wonderful. Yes, we should definitely be striving for this. And we had a group of Black parents who say, yeah, diversity is important, but what's most important to me is that my child gets a good education. If diversity is going to help in that process, wonderful. But if not, I'm more interested in the quality of that education. And so sometimes these terms are mistaken for the end goal as opposed to a means to achieve a more valued end. And so these terms, I think, can be tossed around as jargon sometimes, but they have real meaning for folks. And for some, that meaning is imbued by the media landscape that they consume. And terms like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, or social and emotional learning now have that partisan cue. And I think that's what's going on with, though it's not the same exact term, racially and economically diverse environment is triggering some of that reaction, as opposed to saying getting along with people who are different than they are doesn't have that same connotation. It doesn't have the word racially. It doesn't have the word diverse. And so therefore it doesn't have the same triggering effect, priming effect.
I was talking with a superintendent in Arizona who is somewhat unapologetic around using DEI, although he also has shifted some of the way that he talks because he recognizes that in his community, it's sort of dead on arrival in some respects. And what he's trying to achieve is this idea that equity means making sure the kids have what they need. And so he says, when I say that, then it seems to wash away. Like, we don't need to get into arguments around what does equity mean. I'm simply saying, I want to make sure the kids have what they need. And when he talks about inclusion, in his mind, he says inclusion, but out loud, he says, look, I just want to make sure that every kid feels like they belong. And that has seemed to have calmed waters, and I would say has restored, or at least created a sense of, I don't know if it's trust as much as a sense of feeling heard in a deeply divided community. Lori, what do you think about that sort of shift in that superintendent's speech?
Yeah, I think there's just some words that can be off-putting to certain audiences. I tell a story about, this is going to be seemingly very off topic, but there was a television show, Desperate Housewives. So I'm dating myself. This was like 20 something years ago. But when the creator of it, his name was Mark Cherry, he was pitching the script to all these people. And you can go on Wikipedia and find out he got turned down by everyone, by like Lifetime Television and, shows that you would think, channels that you think would be desperate for content. And he won the Golden Globe that year, and he got up to accept the award. And he said, the show almost didn't get made. And some friend of his said, pitch it to me. Tell me how you're introducing this, because I think the script is great. And he said, well, I'm telling him it's a satire about women in the suburbs. And the guy says, stop. It's a nighttime soap about women in the suburbs. And he said, he didn't change the script. He didn't change anything else. He changed that one word. Instead of saying satire, he said nighttime soap. And suddenly the doors flew open and it became the top show in America and made a whole bunch of people in the stars. And, for years, it was the number one show. So I think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, instead of saying satire, which might be off-putting to some people unintentionally, right? We're going to talk about a nighttime soap. And it's the same content. You're doing the exact same thing. It's the same policy, but we're just not, sometimes unintentionally, using language that just slams the door in our face.
And if I could add to that, we used to study the word equity. And in focus groups, some people know exactly what we're talking about. Some people mistake it for equality. They don't see the difference between equity and equality. And some people look at you like, wait, I thought we were talking about education. Why are we talking about the value of my house? Right? Oh, equity has a different definition. And we use the word, I use we royally here, assuming everyone knows what we're talking about. But it has multiple different definitions. Some of them require a little bit of education kind of, to know exactly what the use case is. And so there's this assumption that everyone knows what we're talking about, even whether or not it's even off-putting, to Lori's point, when sometimes people don't. And so it does require, the language we recommended in that case, Peter, was similar to what you just said about, ensuring that the schools who need the most help get more resources, basing it based on need, et cetera. But again, are we talking about the value of my house? No, that is not what we're talking about. Respondents actually thought we were talking about.
Yes. Wow. That is the perfect transition to the last slide, which is this idea of bipartisan support does exist within several areas. And so there were 4 in particular that really had high percentage of support. Statements like the increased focus. So areas for increased focus in the next administration. And these were preparing students to enter the workforce, attract or retain good teachers, student mental health, and helping students who have fallen behind. And if we're looking for statements of common ground, it seems like superintendents across the nation, if they are anchoring themselves, their strategic plans and their public comments around particularly those 4, I mean, it seems like there are others that have high marks as well, but those 4 in terms of preparing kids to enter the workforce, attracting and retaining good teachers, student mental health, and helping students who have fallen behind, then they'll have good company in terms of support in their communities. Does that seem like a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it goes back to what Jonathan was talking about in terms of outcomes that people can see, like, we're preparing students to enter the workforce. We're not saying college. We're not saying a trade. We're not defining that and what, specific path a student has to take. We're just saying, look, they're going to be prepared to be independent people, who aren't sleeping in their parents' basement for all time. So I think there's a sense, and everyone, when we talk about teachers and we were talking about who do people trust before, everyone has an image of their favorite teacher in their brain, right? I still remember 3rd grade, Mr. Murphy. Like, I can picture that man to this day. And that was a long time ago. So there is, all of these people can see a specific outcome. These are the least partisan things that we often test, are the 4 that you talked about. And there's that bridging divides. Certainly, I named my entire company over that. But, that's what gets people's heads nodding, like we talked about earlier.
It seems even simpler than what I know that even my colleagues and I, we talked about Life Ready, and that even seems a little bit unclear. But talking about being ready for the workforce is a very clear, you might have a clearer image of what that means. Life Ready seems, somewhat really broad and way too big as opposed to the immediate. I want to prepare my kid for the workforce. I don't know. It seems like you're not totally, you may or may not agree with that. So I'm curious.
2 things to this, because I've seen this evolve a little bit over time. I remember distinctly, I was telling Lori this the other day, we did a research project to help a PSA campaign about 10 years ago to close the word gap between the upper fifth of the children of the upper fifth of income earners who hear by the time they're age 5, 30 million more words than the children of the lower fifth of income earners.
I remember it was at a Georgetown study originally that sort of looked at the amount of words that kids heard based on their socioeconomics. It was remarkable.
I forget where the study was. I remember reading about it in the Times at some point. Yeah. But this PSA was designed to target low-income parents and encourage them to read to their children. That was kind of the intervention that they were trying to do. You have the power to kind of close the word gap. And the tagline that we tested was talk to your children to help them succeed. And we involved imagery We brought in ad concepts of little kids wearing lab coats and little boys with suits and ties holding briefcases. And I'll never forget being in focus groups in Oakland where low-income parents said to us, that's the other side of the bay. That's their image of success. What I care about is my kid being happy. If they're a mechanic, but they're happy, that's fine with me. They don't need to go be a lawyer or a doctor and accrue thousands of dollars of debt. And the entire tagline of the campaign changed from talk to your child to help them succeed to talk to your child to help them pursue their dreams. It still has that element, that future orientation, but it's more rooted in the core value of ensuring your child is a happy and functioning adult, as opposed to success, he says in air quotes, which is different for different people and might be a biased concept of what we want for our kids. And sure enough, myself included, all the folks who were kind of designing this campaign, all college educated and all kind of brought our own biases to the ad concepts. And that's why you talk to real people, because they firmly rejected that. Now we've tested that phrase, pursue your dreams versus prepare for the workforce or prepare for that first job. And about 10 years ago, pursuing your dreams, reaching your full potential, it tested higher than entering the workforce, getting a good job, achieving economic stability. That has changed over the last 10 years. They both test extremely well. They are both, to a certain degree, synonymous of what a parent wants for their child in terms of that future orientation, being able to take care of themselves as adults. But I think the more, dare I say, transactional thing in an economic context of achieving economic stability, being able to pay your bills and take care of yourself and not have to live in your parents' basement, and the more direct sort of connotation around that with the term workforce, it has explicitly tested higher. Again, both test very well. They're both very valued concepts for parents and voters alike. But the more direct connotation about the job, the workforce, economic stability has tested higher than the more values laid in terms of pursuing your dreams or reaching your full potential.
Well, and I think even, we talked about attracting and retaining good teachers. It's notable that when we sit down and listen to people talk about what's a good teacher, that can vary dramatically as well. So I will never forget, and this has been a long time, it's been almost 30 years, but sitting down, listening to people in Chicago on the South Side talk about what's a good teacher. Well, that teacher was involved beyond just showing up in the classroom. Like, they went to the basketball game at the high school, right? They knew the kids. And that involvement level was a very different and notably untestable quality for a good teacher. It didn't matter, did they have, this degree or whatever. It was like,
and to what level they knew their content. I will tell you that stayed true 5 years ago. I had a student advisory, and I asked our HR director to come and listen to kids. And we asked them, when you think of a good teacher, because we're about to start our hiring process, we want to know from you first, what do you think, and they got into small groups, they used butcher paper. And it was those qualities of, they come to my play, they come to my sporting event, they know me outside of it had less to do with, they know their content really well. It was, do they connect with me? And I imagine Mr. Murphy connected with you, not just because of content, but because of how he made you feel in terms of being seen.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'm always struck by that level of, how people view a teacher. It's almost more like a calling than a job. And they imbue all the characteristics on them that are unfortunately very hard for most normal humans to meet. But, and I think it has undermined some of the resources, because if it's a calling, you're not doing it for the money, right? So it's sort of spiraled in on how people are willing to resource schools.
I'd like to ask you both a question that I ask of every guest. And so if it's all right, Lori, we'll start with you. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Oh, well, we're all imperfect, aren't we? So I do think it's that willingness to lead despite the potential for failure, right? So it's first admitting what you don't know and being willing to sit down. I've talked a lot about listening, but being able to sit down and listen to others in order to understand fully that spectrum. And just like when I talked about what's a good teacher or what people's definitions are of certain terms, that's incredibly important in order to lead.
Thank you. Jonathan?
I mean, similar to what Lori said, to me, an imperfect leader just describes being a human being. There's no such thing as perfection. I've also found, just in my experience, both in the people who I have worked for and with, who I respect, and what I've tried to model on my own when you're a consultant and people are kind of entrusting you to tell them what's going on. There's a lot of power in saying that you don't know, because that means that when you do know, you really do know. And so acknowledging where you're limited, I think, is actually quite important to give you legitimacy for the stuff you really do know what you're talking about. No one can know everything. No one's going to make 100% of the right decisions. And to me, an imperfect leader describes just being a human being, and where none of us are perfect.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader, called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And our guests are Lori Weigel from New Bridge Strategy and Jonathan Voss from Lake Research Partners. Now, every week in this segment, I ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then we discuss it. Having two professionals who really think about language and messaging and communication, I thought it would be fun if, maybe not so for me, but I'm going to walk through a situation that I had led and ask you for your thoughts around as you hear what happened. Maybe I'll pause from time to time, but I'm gonna talk about a scenario that took place within my own school district. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
All right. So it was, I think, in my second year as superintendent, and our nutrition services fund, which was separate from the rest of the operating fund. I'm not sure why that was the case. Maybe it's a state thing in Missouri, but it had to operate independent of the operating funds. And we were projecting that we were going to be in the red by the end of the year. And this was a fund that typically had robust balances, but this wasn't the case anymore. And so we were trying to figure out what was happening. It wasn't about purchasing of equipment. It was more to do with the fact that in the past, we had pretty good participation in turning in paperwork for free reduced lunch services, or children who were eligible. The forms were turned in. It also had to do, to some extent, with the fact that we were trying to do some more farm to school type of things, and that becomes more expensive when you're not relying more heavily on commodities and things like that. And so children, and to some extent, policy from the federal government was dictating how much sodium could be in food, how much sugar could be in food. The lunch no longer had to be sort of as a whole considered nutritious, but each item on the plate had to be considered nutritious. And so that meant things like chicken nuggets, we had this very short-lived naked nuggets testing that no kid wanted. And yet we were relying on children to buy lunch to essentially fund children who were eligible for free or reduced lunch. So we needed full participation, and we were a school district with almost 50% free or reduced lunch. So we really had to leverage children to pay for lunch. And when they didn't like the lunch, they weren't buying it and they were bringing their own. And then our balances went down. Okay, so that's the context of what was happening. And then we noticed that there were more and more children participating in free and reduced lunch who had not turned in the paperwork. And what we discovered was some just didn't turn it in. And so we had to work really hard to get those forms turned in. Others had turned in the forms, but were not eligible and essentially were part of what I would call the working poor. And families sent children to school and said, we'll run up the bill, but we can't really afford to buy lunch or to provide lunch. And then there were some, your sort of sovereign citizens of the world in our district who said, I'm not paying. You provide for my kid. So I was approached with, look, we're really struggling. And the advice was, why don't we do this? We're not going to punish children there was one district that put kids' names on the wall outside the lunchroom that said, like, here are the kids who have not paid their bills, and this is how much they owe. And it was just horrifying that you would publicly traumatize a child for the decisions that adults in their lives were making. And so what was advised to me was, how about this? we're not going to not give kids food, but we can't allow them to have the full meal. Why don't we'll give them a sack lunch? And the sack lunch was a milk, an apple, and a cheese sandwich. And I failed in the sense of what we tell all system thinkers is avoid the impulse to make a quick decision. And so I said, oh, okay, that sounds fine. And so kids were coming through, and they were coming through with their trays, and then the trays were being taken away, and they were given a sack lunch. So already that image was horrible. Teachers were seeing it. Nutrition services employees, who themselves are among the lowest wage earners, were now forced to take food away from a kid and give them the sack lunch. And I didn't budge initially because we were like, well, we got to get these forms filled out and we've got to really send a message kind of thing. And I'm just to this moment still embarrassed by that decision. And then I was at a restaurant, and somebody saw me at the restaurant who was outraged by what was happening and asked my server to bring me a cheese sandwich instead of my meal, really making a point publicly. And I mean, really hammered home, what the hell was I doing? What was I thinking? And so we convened our principals, who rightfully were really upset, that they had not been part of the conversation. So I'm making decisions without the people most impacted. And then we're really pretty clear on, we've got to make sure that we continue to provide kids with a full meal. And so we reversed course. We looked at school budgets to figure out how to make that work. And so we started to provide meals. So in the community, in a pretty divided community, so a university town, but yet 300 square miles. And so we are urban, suburban, and rural. And parts of the community said, it's about time that you provided a full meal. Why would you punish a child for the decisions an adult might have made? Or because, that my child is lucky that I have the income to be able to provide, and you're going to punish a child who doesn't. And another large part of the community was really upset, saying that's not the role of schools, and you shouldn't be paying it, and you should be going after parents. And so I found myself at this community meeting where I was really struggling to explain why we were doing this. It was a more conservative part of our community that had, in that moment, right, in that room. So I'm not painting all conservatives as saying like we shouldn't do this. In that room at that moment, this was the group that said that this is not our role, and that, how dare I? And I was really struggling until somebody took me aside and said, simply say, you can't learn if you're hungry. And when I started to say that, I saw an absolute shift in how the community was responding to the needs of children. And so when I think about what got overlooked, obviously what got overlooked was I failed to involve people in the decision. It was made pretty quickly. I learned a lot about relationships, in that the people most directly involved with children really felt that they had let children down. Their relationship was paramount, and that I needed to then rebuild in some cases, because I say I'm a human-centered leader. And so I had to rebuild some of those relationships. I learned a lot about that. Obviously, what frustrated me was my own failure to lead well. And what I could have done differently, obviously, was to engage people, talk about how we were going to, what is our goal, and then how will we get there in a way that doesn't hurt children. And in the end, what was something that was good that came out of it, I think, was the way we shifted, the way we talked about things publicly, as well as the fact that children had full and healthy and high quality meals and could, absolutely engage in their learning because they had, that they were well fed. So, all right, that's my sort of quick after action review. Either of you, I'd like to hear your thoughts as you were hearing this.
So, well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. It sounds like a fascinating case study and moment in time, and appreciate you sharing what you've learned. And clearly I can't speak to the organizational part of things, but your experience frankly tracks with what our research has showed in kind of three key ways. First, I think there is a tendency for some people to speak about an issue from their perspective. And it reminds me almost of a candidate I worked for who their slogan when they were running was a new generation of leadership. That's how they thought about themselves. We tested, and it's actually what voters cared about was cleaning up the mess in that state capitol. They didn't care about the new generation. And so we sometimes think about the world through our eyes, and it's really important to have that empathy and understand the world from other people's perspective. So you thinking of this as it's our duty, that's an arguable thing. But getting back to what we talked about at the top of the show about that future-oriented value and being really able to connect to that and to your audience, I think is lesson number one. Secondly, I think within the educational space in particular, there's so much focus on problems. And sometimes when we talk about problems, we convince people that there's nothing we can do about it. We remind people that there are so many problems, and it's so critical to be able to connect things to solutions. And we have found, and one of the things we tested in particular was this phrase: real learning can't happen when kids start the day hungry or stressed out about problems at home. So let's make sure those who need it have healthy meals and trusty counselors. Now, it creates the emotional space that you experienced in that room as well for people to connect with it. But it also highlights a problem and connects it to a solution. I think people are actually motivated by when they know there's something they can do about it. It helps overcome some of the cynicism that we find that can kind of make it problematic to get the change that we need. And the third thing, which I think is connected to all of those, is the use of language that paints a picture of what quality education is. I think there is a tendency to use jargon and abstractions. But when we, getting back to why people value their local school more than national public schools, when we evoke the imagery of the classroom, of being a hungry child who can't then focus during the day, when we paint that emotional picture for people, I think we help activate the values we want to activate in order to get the support for the policy change there. So I think being able to focus on what people value as opposed to what we perceive to be the more important thing is number one. And that's not easy. Not everyone has that immediate instinct. Secondly, connecting problems to solutions and not just talking about the problem, but really saying we can solve this. This is a solvable thing. I think people are hungry for that. And then thirdly, using language that paints that picture and creates that imagery for people, I think is really powerful.
Thank you so much.
I think too, we have seen a shift post-pandemic in terms of people's recognition of schools as essentially a safety net for children in certain income brackets. We didn't used to see that function of schools top of mind, even being connected. And now, whether it was the summer and people volunteering or donating food so that kids could get meals during the summer, there's just been a light change. I know in one state, when we tested schools being a safety net, it was the most recognized attribute of schools, bar none. They were most likely to say, oh yeah, that's something, whether or not they found it to be important or not, and rate quite as high as teaching children. But that idea that schools were filling this function was something that was much better recognized than almost anything else. And so we do have these occasions where events happen, and it certainly can shift people's recognition of what schools actually do and the functions that they fill in our society in a very different way.
I really appreciate both of your feedback. And, I ask people each week to engage in this, and I don't think I've ever really considered how difficult it is to really face a failure. We call it an experience or an event in your life, but truly this after action review is to say, okay, I made a mistake and this is what the mid-course correction I made, and this is what I learned. For both of you to be able to put your expertise on where a public may perceive and what we've learned from that on a larger scale, truly, really valuable. So I think we'll end there for today. And I will say thank you. Our guests today were Lori Weigel from Newbridge Strategy and Jonathan Voss from Lake Research Partners. Truly, I am grateful for your time. I know you're both incredibly busy. I think this is going to be one of those evergreen episodes that superintendents are going to continue to return to as they think about how they communicate with their communities and how they talk about what they perceive to be what a community wants for its children, and then for them to be able to deliver that along with their school boards, no doubt. So thank you so much for your time.